Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 3, Part 2. We pick up then from where we left off. Remember that both Macbeth and Banquo have been given prophecies by the witches. Macbeth, keen to know more about these prophecies, has commanded the witches to stay, but he has no power over the realm of the supernatural, and so they disobey him. When he says, "Speak, I charge you," the witches vanish, and it is here that we resume our study. Banquo says this: "The earth hath bubbles, as the water has, and these are of them. Whither are they vanished?" What Banquo is observing here, and it has to be done through language because in Shakespeare's day there were no special effects or anything like that on stage, so it all had to be done through language. What Banquo is commenting on here is the fact that the witches have just disappeared in front of them. They've faded away in the same way that bubbles pop and disappear in water, so the witches have vanished in front of their eyes. Macbeth says, "Into the air, and what seemed corporal melted as breath into the wind." He too is stating that these witches looked real, they looked tangible, it looked as if you could go up and touch them, they seemed corporal, but they have just melted away, faded away as breath into the wind. Then he says, "Would they had stayed." In other words, I wish they'd stayed. The witches' prophecies have really captured Macbeth's interest. He wants to know more. He wants to know how these prophecies have been fulfilled. It's a small and seemingly insignificant line, "would they had stayed," but it's actually really important because it's proving, Shakespeare is proving to us, the audience, that the witches have said something which has captured Macbeth's interest. And of course, what we have to remember is this is Shakespeare showing us the way in which Macbeth's ambitious thoughts, that at the moment seem to be secret, these ambitious thoughts in his mind about becoming king are now being played upon by the witches' prophecies. That's why he wishes they'd stayed. Banquo, in his next few lines, is trying to get his head around whether what they've seen was actually there or not, or whether they've been hallucinating. He says, "Were such things here as we do speak about, or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner?" Hallucinogenic drugs are nothing new. Even in Shakespeare's day, there were certain herbs and plants which, if you chewed or smoked them, would provide a hallucinogenic effect. And that's what Banquo's talking about here. When he mentions the insane root, he's saying to Macbeth, have we been taking hallucinogenic drugs? Have we actually seen what we've just seen? Or have we been hallucinating? They haven't actually been taking drugs. What they have seen was actually there. But because it is so unusual, it is so odd, these supernatural beings appearing to them, speaking to them, and then disappearing, that Banquo is just wondering for a second, have we been hallucinating? Did we imagine it all? Or were they really there? Now, you might remember in my last tutorial that I mentioned that these prophecies which have been made to Banquo about the fact that his children will in the future become kings will eventually come back to play on Macbeth's mind and fuel Macbeth's paranoia. We actually get a foreshadowing of this here, because when the conversation turns to the prophecies that they've just been given, Macbeth mentions the prophecy that Banquo has been given before mentioning any of the ones that he was given. He says to Banquo, "Your children shall be kings." To which Banquo replies, "You shall be king." Macbeth says, "And Thane of Cawdor too, went it not so?" To which Banquo replies, "To the self-same tune and words. Yes, that is indeed what they said." Then he notices that some emissaries from the king, other lords, thanes of Scotland, are galloping to meet them. He asks, "Who's here?" and two characters, Ross and Angus, enter. Ross speaks first. "The king hath happily received, Macbeth, the news of thy success, and when he reads thy personal venture in the rebels' sight, his wonders and his praises do contend which should be thine or his. Silenced with that, in viewing o'er the rest of the self-same day, he finds thee in the stout Norwegian ranks, nothing afeard of what thyself didst make, strange images of death. As thick as tale came post with post, and every one did bear thy praises in his kingdom's great defence, and poured them down before him." Angus says, "We are sent to give thee from our royal master thanks, only to herald thee into his sight, not pay thee." Ross chips in again, and this is one of the key lines in this discussion. "And for an earnest of a greater honour, he bade me from him call thee Thane of Cawdor, in which addition, hail, most worthy Thane, for it is thine." Ross has come to tell Macbeth that King Duncan is really happy with all that he's heard about Macbeth's valour and bravery in defeating the rebellion and the Norwegian invasion, and as a reward for what Macbeth has done, he now gives the title of Thane of Cawdor to Macbeth. This is the point in the play when the very first prophecy that the witches gave Macbeth comes true. And of course it's important from a plot point of view that the first prophecy has come true so quickly after it has been given. The reason being that Macbeth is now more inclined to believe that if one of the prophecies has come true, the prophecy about being Thane of Cawdor, then that means that one day he will also be king. Banquo can hardly believe that the first prophecy has come true. He says, "What? Can the devil speak true?" Notice how when he's referring to the witches, he mentions the devil, because remember, witches were seen as agents of the devil. He's asking, can the devil and the agents of the devil actually speak the truth? Because that first prophecy has indeed come true. Macbeth can't quite believe it either. "The Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" Remember, we were saying that Macbeth doesn't know that the Thane of Cawdor has had any involvement in the Norwegian invasion, and he thinks he's still alive. I want you to notice here the use of clothing metaphors. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes? In other words, why are you giving me a title that does not rightly belong to me? This is one of a number of clothing references and metaphors which are made in the play, and it's the first of them that are made in this particular scene, and I'm going to look at the end of the scene at the importance of these clothing metaphors. Angus then fills Macbeth in on some key details. "Who was the Thane lives yet, but under heavy judgment bears that life which he deserves to lose. Whether he was combined with those of Norway, or did line the rebel with hidden help and vantage, or that with both he laboured in his country's wrack, I know not. But treason's capital, confessed and proved, have overthrown him." So Angus says to Macbeth, yes, the Thane of Cawdor does live, but he is already under sentence of death. And of course this is where he's bringing to Macbeth's attention the fact that the Thane of Cawdor has been a traitor. Angus isn't quite sure whether he allied himself directly with Norway, the King of Norway, or whether he provided reinforcements or money or equipment, whether he was combined with those of Norway or did line the rebel with hidden help and vantage, or that with both he laboured in his country's wrack, I know not. So Angus isn't exactly sure what the Thane of Cawdor has done, but treason's capital, confessed and proved, have overthrown him. It has been proven that the Thane of Cawdor was a traitor. When Macbeth speaks next, you should have in your script a bracketed stage direction that says aside. Now, this is a common dramatic technique in Shakespeare, and it's important that you understand what it's for and why it's used. An aside is where a character speaks directly to the audience or to themselves. What they say in an aside is not heard by the other characters on stage. It's a way of characters sharing their private thoughts with the audience and with themselves. In this aside, Macbeth says, "Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, the greatest is behind." That bit is the aside. What Macbeth is thinking here is, if I am now both Thane of Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, then the greatest, meaning becoming king, is behind, yet to come. So privately, in this aside, he is confident that as he is now both Thane of Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, the greatest title, that of the kingship, will follow in due course. He will be king in due course. That's the end of the aside. He then turns to Ross and Angus and says, "Thanks for your pains," meaning thanks for taking the trouble to gallop all the way here and tell me that I have this reward. Then he takes Banquo to one side and he says this, "Do you not hope your children shall be kings, when those that gave the Thane of Cawdor to me promise no less to them?" Are you now confident, is what Macbeth is saying. Are you now confident that the prophecies that the witches gave you about your children being kings will come true, because the prophecy that they made to me about being Thane of Cawdor has come true? Do you not hope your children shall be kings? So he's having this little private discussion with Banquo about the prophecies. Banquo, however, is not yet ready to fully trust the witches. And this is an important trait of Banquo's character that I want you to note. He is far more wary of the witches than Macbeth is, not frightened of them in the way that Macbeth was, but he is not prepared to take what they've said at face value. And what Banquo says in his next speech is him giving some very clear and very good advice to Macbeth not to be too trusting of the forces of darkness. This is what he says. "That trusted home might yet enkindle you unto the crown, besides the Thane of Cawdor. But 'tis strange, and oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence." The advice that Banquo is giving here demonstrates what a perceptive character he is. What he's saying in this speech, he's saying to Macbeth, just be careful about trusting what the witches have said, because oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence. Often, the forces of darkness, the forces of evil, will tell us things that come true. The trivial things, the small things will come true, so that we believe in the forces of darkness. But often, in deepest consequence, when it's most important, they will betray us. So just be careful, Macbeth. Don't be too trusting of the fact that the first prophecy has come true, because trusting in the witches might indeed win us to our harm, might lead us into harm's way, might lead us into danger. Put simply, he's saying to Macbeth, you cannot be too trusting of what the witches have told you. It's very good advice. It proves that Shakespeare is portraying Banquo as a character of wisdom, which is in contrast to Macbeth. Not that Macbeth has no wisdom, but Banquo is not prepared to trust the witches at face value, unlike Macbeth, who is now convinced that if one prophecy has come true, then the other one will come true in the future. Banquo turns to Ross and Angus and says, "Cousins, a word, I pray you." They go off to one side because you'll notice that what Macbeth says next is also said in an aside. It's his private thoughts which he's sharing with the audience. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. When he references the two truths, he's talking about the two prophecies that he's been given by the witches. Notice how, even though Banquo's just given him some very good advice, Macbeth is absolutely convinced that these two prophecies will come true. One of them already has. So therefore, in his mind, the second one will as well. He describes the prophecies as two truths having been told, and that these two truths are going to help him towards the imperial theme, the idea of royal power. Then you'll notice in most scripts there's like a dash here, and Macbeth speaks openly to Ross and Angus once again. "I thank you, gentlemen." He thanks them a second time, but then he goes back to his aside, his private thoughts. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. This advice, this supernatural advice that I've been given, it can't be ill, it can't be evil. At the same time, it cannot be good. Notice that we're in the realm of paradox once again. Macbeth continues. If ill, if evil, if this advice, this supernatural soliciting that I've been given is evil, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. If the witches are evil, if the prophecies that they've given are evil, why is it then that one of those prophecies has come true? Why is it that they have promised me success and I have that success? I am Thane of Cawdor. If that's come true, then this supernatural soliciting can't be evil. But he goes on, and it's this bit that's the most important of what he says in this speech. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. So, on the one hand, the witches' prophecies cannot be evil if one of them has already come true. But he then considers this. How can the prophecies be true if they have put into his mind images which he says doth unfix my hair, make my hair stand on end, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs? They make my heart pound against my ribs because of stress and fear. What is Macbeth talking about? Well, it's actually quite straightforward. Macbeth, having been told that one day he will be king, has already thought that the way to become king is to murder King Duncan. when he talks about a horrid image that comes into his mind that makes his hair stand on end and his heart beat against his ribs in stress, what he is admitting to there is that he has already thought about murder. That's what he's talking about when he mentions the horrid image. He actually mentions murder later in this speech. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man. Now, this is where you as a student can evaluate what your interpretation of Macbeth is here. Let me give you some suggestions. On the one hand, we might look at Macbeth unsympathetically here, because remember how Macbeth's character has already been established in the play so far. He's noble, he's brave, he's valiant, he has fought to protect his king against a rebellion and an invasion, and yet he admits at this point that murder of the king has already crossed his mind. That might make us somewhat unsympathetic towards his character if he's already thought about murder. On the other hand, you could look at him a little more sympathetically, in that, even though the thought of murdering Duncan in order to become king has gone through his mind, that thought frightens him. He describes it as a horrid image. It frightens him so much that his hair stands on end, and it makes his heart beat because he's stressed by the very thought, suggesting that at this point, even though murder's crossed his mind, he would be reluctant to carry out that deed. So that might make us view him sympathetically. It is your job really as a student, when you're looking at Macbeth's character as a whole, when we've considered the whole play and been through the whole play and analysed it, whether looking back at this scene you see Macbeth in a more unsympathetic or a more sympathetic light. It's just something for you to consider. Macbeth is so entranced by this image that he has in his mind that he's sort of staring off into space, entranced, which is why Banquo says to Ross and Angus, "Look how our partner's rapt. Look how he is completely enraptured, focused." He doesn't know what's going through Macbeth's mind, but we have to imagine that from Banquo's point of view, Macbeth is stood there on the heath staring into space as if he's lost in thought and daydreaming. We go back to Macbeth here. Keyline this. If chance will have me king, why chance may crown me without my stir. What he's saying here is this. If I am going to become king in the future, if fate has the kingship in store for me, that's what he means by chance. He's talking here about the concept of fate. If it is my fate to become king, then maybe I will be crowned without me having to do anything. That's what he means when he says without my stir. If chance will have me king, if fate has it in store for me that I will be king in the future, why chance may crown me without my stir. The reason I say that this is an important line is because at this stage in the play, and when you're looking back at Macbeth's character as a whole, he seems to be saying at this point that even though the idea of murder has gone through his mind, he'd rather not do it. He would rather leave it to fate. He would rather not have to murder in order to get the kingship. He would rather have fate crown him without him having to do anything in order to get the kingship. In other words, without having to go through with a murder. You'll notice now in Banquo's speech the second of the two clothing metaphors, which I'm going to have a look at in a little bit more detail shortly. Banquo says to Ross and Angus, "New honours come upon him, like our strange garments, cleave not to their mould, but with the aid of use." Using this clothing metaphor, what Banquo's saying here to Ross and Angus is the reason he thinks Macbeth is stood there staring into space lost in thought is because Macbeth is still trying to get his head round the fact that he is now the new Thane of Cawdor. He has been given, metaphorically, new clothes, new garments, if you like, a new role. And what Banquo's saying is that he's clearly a little bit intimidated, maybe, or overwhelmed would be a better word. Macbeth is somewhat overwhelmed by his new role. And it's like when you're given new clothes, it takes a little bit of time to get used to those new clothes. In the same way, Macbeth's new title of Thane of Cawdor, this new role that he's been given, he will get used to it in time. He's just a little bit overawed or overwhelmed by the thought of the responsibilities at the moment. We go back to Macbeth. Come what come may, time and the hour runs through the roughest day. This is another of those lines which suggests that Macbeth would rather leave things to fate, come what come may. He'd rather not have to take any sort of action, certainly not violent action, in order to become king. Banquo and Ross and Angus are ready to leave now. They need to get back to Duncan's headquarters, and Banquo, cutting through Macbeth's thoughts, says, "Worthy Macbeth, we stay upon your leisure." In other words, we're ready to go now. Notice that Banquo uses the description of Macbeth as worthy. I think Shakespeare does this deliberately here because we, the audience, have just been given an insight into Macbeth's mind, that murder has already crossed Macbeth's mind. But then he has Banquo describe Macbeth as worthy. Macbeth comes out of his reverie at this point, and he says to Banquo and the others, "Give me your favour. Oh, I'm sorry for keeping you waiting. My dull brain was wrought with things forgotten. Kind gentlemen, your pains are registered where every day I turn the leaf to read them. Let us toward the king. Right, let's go. Sorry to keep you waiting. Apologies, I've been thinking about what you've just said to me. Let's now go back to King Duncan." But before they leave, Macbeth takes Banquo to one side. He says this: "Think about what hath chanced, and, more time, the interim having weighed it, let us speak our free hearts each to other." Think about what's happened today, Banquo. Think about the prophecies that we've just been given. When we've got a quiet moment to ourselves a little bit later, let's talk about what we've encountered in a little bit more depth. Let's talk more freely when nobody else is listening about the prophecies that we've been given. Banquo replies very gladly, "Yes, I think that's a good idea. We should talk about this in more detail." The reason I dwell on this bit is because this is a conversation that will never take place. In fact, when Banquo raises the subject in Act 2, Macbeth, having said that he would like to discuss this very freely, actually dismisses the idea of talking in any great depth about the witches' prophecies, and there's a reason for that we'll look at when we get to it. Macbeth then brings the scene to a close by saying, "Till then, enough, till then, let's be quiet about it, we won't speak any more about the witches." And then to the full gathering, including Ross and Angus, he says, "Come, friends." In other words, let's go. And off they all go together, bringing this important scene to its conclusion. But just before we bring this tutorial to its conclusion, I just want to look at two further things with you in greater depth. One is the use of these clothing metaphors that we've already had in this scene. Remember that Macbeth says that calling him the Thane of Cawdor is dressing him in borrowed robes. In other words, this is a title that doesn't belong to me. And only a few lines ago, we were discussing the fact that Banquo, when he's discussing the fact that Macbeth is trying to get his head round this new responsibility, this new position, he describes this new position as new honours come upon him like our strange garments. Why is the clothing metaphor so important in this play? Well, I'll tell you. If you think about it, clothing can often be used as a disguise. It's a covering to hide what is underneath. In the same way, Macbeth, as the play continues, needs to disguise his true thoughts, and he's already had to do some disguising of his true thoughts. Remember, murder has already gone through his mind. So the reason that we have these clothing metaphors in the play, it is Shakespeare bringing to our attention this idea of the theme of disguise and deceit. In fact, disguise and deceit and appearance and reality are key themes in the play, and we will see further examples of these key themes of disguise, deceit, appearance and reality in future scenes. Also, this is one of the key scenes when we consider the role of the witches in Macbeth. And one of the things that I want to look at with you is, why is it that the witches come to Macbeth and put these prophecies in his mind in the first place, knowing that Macbeth is full of ambition and that by planting the seed of becoming king in the future into his mind, it's going to lead him ultimately to murder? Why do the witches do this? What is it that Shakespeare is trying to say? Well, I would suggest it's this. If you are ever given an essay on the witches where you have to discuss their role in the play, I would suggest that one of the strongest arguments for explaining why Shakespeare has the witches choose Macbeth, why they plant these prophecies in his mind, is because, remember, at the very start of the play, we are left in no doubt that the witches enjoy causing chaos. They enjoy causing turmoil. It's what the agents of evil do. Remember, in this scene as well, we've had discussions between the witches of the chaos that they've caused by going around killing swine, killing pigs, and ruining people's lives. We've got the first witch taking revenge on a sailor's wife just because she didn't give her a chestnut. By appearing to Macbeth and planting this seed in his mind that one day he's going to be king, they're playing on his ambition. And ultimately, when Macbeth becomes king, he presides over a tyrannical regime. He is a tyrannical ruler. And Scotland is plunged into a period of chaos and death once Macbeth is on the throne. And that essentially explains why the witches do what they do. They do it simply to enjoy causing chaos. The death and the violence and the bloodshed which is going to ensue as a result of Macbeth being on the throne is just so that the witches, the forces of darkness, can enjoy this period of chaos. It's how, if you like, the supernatural beings get their enjoyment, get their fun. It's almost this idea, wind Macbeth up, watch him go, and then enjoy the chaos and the death which will then follow. That's one of my key explanations as to why the witches, or rather, why Shakespeare has the witches do what they do in the play. It is simply this idea of revelling in, enjoying, creating chaos. In the next tutorial then, we will look at Act 1, Scene 4, and the significant issues that arise in that scene. So, join me next time, and I'll see you then.